We begin with the news that the vice president has tested positive for COVID-19. She was spotted arriving at the White House with a mask on a little after 10 a.m. Eastern this morning. As the news broke, you see her there with the binder in hand. It was a little while later that they told us that she has tested positive and is now working from home. For more on this and the day's top political stories, let's bring in Skyler Henry and Courtney Subramanian. Skyler, of course, covers Washington for CBS News. Courtney is a White House correspondent for the LA Times. Skyler, let's start with you there on the North Lawn. What is the White House saying about how close the VP has been to the president in recent days and what her current state is?
Well, hey, Ed, good to see you. Well, they say she hasn't been close to the president, at least fairly recently, saying that the vice president, the last time she was with President Biden, at least in person, was last Monday. That was during the White House Easter egg roll here at the White House. She, of course, has been traveling in California. He as well. And she was not a part of yesterday's meetings here at the White House, but she was supposed to be here today to receive those daily briefings along with the president. Now, this all happened after she took both a PCR test as well as a rapid test. Both of those results became positive, and so now she, of course, is being forced to isolate. A White House spokesperson said that she has no symptoms. She's feeling fine. President Biden has been in contact with her by phone to talk about it if she needs anything at all. But I think this is very important, Ed, and we've heard medical professionals talk about this over and over again, the significance of being vaccinated. We know that the vice president is not only vaccinated, but double boosted. And I think medical professionals say that this is really what we're going to have to, see in terms of us living with this pandemic, especially with this more contagious variant. Yes, the likelihood of many Americans contracting the virus is going to go up, especially as we're looking at cases around the country do that, but hospitalizations and deaths are going down. Now, in the vice president's case, we've talked about what this could possibly mean. She is going to continue to work. The White House says that she will remain in isolation until she has that negative test. But Ed, this is just the latest official here in Washington to test positive for the coronavirus. And I think it'll be interesting to see how and if anything changes. We know White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was asked about this today in terms of policy. If something like that were to change, she said that she doesn't really think that anything will change immediately. But it will be interesting to see how, if they decide to keep President Biden away from certain events. I don't think that will happen or anything like that, but we know that there is an increased likelihood, perhaps, of the president contracting it, the coronavirus. And as a matter of fact, COVID coordinator Ashish Jha was asked about that earlier today, whether they feel as though the president could be potentially exposed to COVID. But I mean, again, going to the point where I was saying before about him being not only vaccinated but double boosted, the likelihood of any sort of severe symptoms reduces dramatically.
Yeah, and she's obviously now the most senior Biden administration official, most senior official in government to contract the virus. And it comes after a pretty intense West Coast swing. Courtney, you were inside the bubble, so to speak, with her in California. Pierce the bubble a bit. Where did she travel on that trip? And when you're traveling with her, what are the COVID protocols like? Explain it to those of us who don't necessarily see it all up close.
Sure. Well, it was a fairly small group of us, and that's because the trip was designed for the vice president to have a lot of downtime last week. She spent Tuesday and Wednesday with no public events at her Los Angeles home with the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff. But we did have events on Monday. We went to Vandenberg Air Force Base for some remarks where she met with officials from Space Force and delivered remarks. She attended an intimate DNC fundraiser later that night with a group of about 30 people. And then on Thursday, she had a quick stop in San Francisco for a maternal health care event at the University of California, San Francisco health facility, where she did tour inside the facility. She was wrist bumping everyone she encountered, but she was maskless the whole time. And California, of course, no longer requires masks indoors and has lifted most of its restrictions like the rest of the country. So she was following state protocols, but the state is also facing a gradual uptick in COVID cases like the rest of the country. So I think this underscores the risks that she and other White House officials face, like the rest of the country, with some of this travel. And as for your question on what it's like inside the bubble, there are no requirements for masks at this point. I will say when she did come to the back of the plane to briefly talk to the press before we left for California, she was masked. But most of the time when we were at events and encountered her, she was not masked as she met with people. So, it is part of the risk that these officials face. And of course, we should note that she's had several close calls. Her husband, Doug Emhoff, tested positive just a few weeks ago, and her communications director, Jamal Simmons, tested positive earlier this month after the Gridiron dinner. So we've talked to the staff members about this. They maintain that they are very safe and follow the guidelines wherever they go. But the risk, of course, is still there.
Yeah, it's funny. You said wrist bumping, and I thought you had misspoke and meant fist bumping. But then the video proof there was that, yes, in fact, she was wrist bumping people while in California last week. Speaking of COVID, Skyler, with Congress back, the White House is trying to get some unfinished business regarding attempts to get more COVID funding through Congress to pay for ongoing pandemic relief, but also the potential for future pandemics of other varieties, research, replenishing stockpiles and whatnot, and preparing for the potential need for more vaccine, the new COVID pill and whatnot. Where do things stand on getting that money through Congress and to the president's desk for his signature?
Well, in a lot of ways, at a standstill at this point, Ed. Dr. Jha spoke about that in the press briefing earlier today, urging Congress to consider beefing up that COVID response chest, if you will, in terms of funding to make sure that if and when we see a new variant, especially in the fall or winter, that Americans can be prepared for it, particularly as it pertains to making sure that there are treatments available. They're unrolling that Paxlovid pill that seems to be doing well in terms of quelling a lot of the severe symptoms of those that may have contracted COVID. So that was certainly one area, but then also making sure that everyone has the resources that they need in case we start to see another spike or a surge in terms of the pandemic, especially later in the year. One of Dr. Jha's points was that, where we are in the line in terms of receiving medicines from a Moderna or a Pfizer is relatively high, but we're also seeing other countries compete to try to, make sure that they have access to those resources as well. And part of that is the amount of money that they are willing to commit to receive said resources. And so the White House wants to make sure and ensure that Americans have what they need to help continue to try to wade their way through this pandemic. Now, those on the opposite end of the spectrum would say that in terms of funding, a lot of the money that's been appropriated in terms of coronavirus relief hasn't even been spent yet. And so really we should start to focus on that money before deciding to invest even more funding towards COVID response. But again, as you and I both know, we've talked about that. We've started to see a lot more comprehensive plans from states, cities, and other municipalities that have really started to break down how they plan on using that COVID funding. And so the Biden administration wants to make sure that they have even more funding because they feel as though they would rather be proactive than be caught flat-footed if and when another surge happens.
Yeah. And, sometimes it takes Congress an actual crisis or a deadline, and there isn't one of those in either case. So you could argue the pandemic's continuing, and that is a crisis, but we'll see how that goes, and they've got some time to work it out. Courtney, we are beginning to hear of departures from the White House and footsteps that others are preparing to go. In this case, it's senior advisor to the president, Cedric Richmond, former congressman from Louisiana, who's leaving a White House job to work for the Democratic National Committee and do some other outside political work. What are you hearing about why he's leaving and about who else might be on their way for the exits?
Yeah, well, just last week, he said he would only leave his position at the White House if Biden asked him to. Psaki hinted at this yesterday when she was asked about the announcement. She said it's something the president is excited about and has asked him to do. And as you mentioned, Ed, that is moving into a role outside the White House that sort of mirrors his role inside the White House as a senior advisor to the DNC. But really as a bridge to the White House, he was key on issues such as voting rights and police reform, and worked as a liaison between the White House and Congress, where he served as a Louisiana congressman. And I think you'll see a similar role there at the DNC, again, serving as a bridge between the DNC. DNC chairman Jamie Harrison notably has a bit of a tense relationship with the White House. So I'd expect to see Cedric again serve as that liaison between the DNC and the White House as we move into the midterm season, and be that surrogate for Biden on the campaign trail. It's going to be a tricky job. And you heard what I heard last week, which was that he says, "I serve at the pleasure of the president." Well, the president would prefer he go elsewhere to help out right now. And so he's going to do that. Real quick, Courtney, going to be a big week in terms of immigration policy on the Hill, with the impending end of Title 42 that Trump implemented, immigration, really more public health policy that allows authorities to quickly expel migrants and deny asylum seekers entry into the U.S. If you were riding a quick elevator ride with somebody asking you about this, what would you tell them to look forward to this week in terms of how the White House is dealing with this and how Congress might react? Well, I think most notably today, we heard from the White House. They held a background call with senior administration officials and unveiled a detailed plan from the Department of Homeland Security that was intended to respond to some of the criticism they've received from both Republicans and some Democrats who are up for tough re-elections in November. To put in place once the order is lifted on May 23rd. And this plan was intended to, show that they are prepared once the order is lifted. And that included efforts like surging more officers and agents to the border, fast-tracking deportation procedures for those who don't qualify for asylum, and increasing temporary detention capacity. But notably on the call, one of the administration officials was asked about a Louisiana judge's signal yesterday that this judge intended to block the lifting of the order on May 23rd. There's a hearing for this case scheduled on May 10th. And the administration official said that the administration plans to comply with that order if and when a temporary order is put in place, which gives them a little bit of political cover from some of the pressure they're facing on the Hill. So I think the pressure is a bit off for the Biden administration this week.
Well, we will see. They're going to face a lot of questions from Democrats and Republicans in those hearings, and we'll be tracking it. Skyler Henry at the White House, Courtney Subramanian of the LA Times, thank you both.